They called it the Cadillac of trucks. Chrome grills, Art Deco fenders, a sled dog hood ornament that looked like it belonged on a yacht. Diamond T built 250,000 of them over 56 years. They hauled tanks across North Africa. They invented the Australian road train. And then a company from Cleveland bought them, stripped the name off the hood, and erased them from history. This is the story of how America's finest truck was quietly murdered by corporate accounting. Chicago, 1905. A 22-year-old kid named Charles Arthur Tilt builds his first automobile. Not a truck, a car, a proper touring car, powerful enough to compete with anything on the road. His father was a shoemaker, and the old man had a logo for his best products, a big letter T inside a diamond shape. The diamond meant quality. The T meant tilt. Charles borrowed it. The Diamond T Motor Car Company was born. For 6 years, Tilt built passenger cars, good ones too, priced up to $5,200 at a time when a Ford cost a few hundred. These were premium machines. But in 1911, a customer walked in and asked him to build a truck, 1.5 tons, conventional layout, 4-cylinder engine, chain drive. Tilt built it. And then he looked at the numbers. Trucks sold. Trucks kept selling. Cars were glamorous, but trucks paid the bills. He dropped passenger cars entirely and never looked back. Now here's where it gets different from every other truck maker of the era. Tilt had come from the automobile world. He understood style. He understood that the person writing the check cared about what the thing looked like. And he had this philosophy that he repeated so often, it became the company motto. A truck doesn't have to be homely. Think about that for a second. In 1911, trucks were ugly, brutal, utilitarian boxes on wheels, solid tires, open cabs, exposed engines, chain drive. Nobody cared what they looked like because nobody looked at them. They were tools, pure and simple, and they looked like tools. Tilt disagreed, fundamentally. He believed that the person spending money on a truck deserved something worth looking at. That pride of ownership applied to commercial vehicles the same as it applied to automobiles. So he started putting the same attention to paint, chrome, and proportions into his trucks that other manufacturers reserved for luxury cars. By the late 1920s, Diamond T had been completely restyled. Chrome-plated radiator grills replaced the bare metal fronts. 6-cylinder Hercules engines replaced the old 4s. Steel spider wheels with pneumatic tires became standard. Electric lights replaced oil lamps. The trucks looked modern. They looked deliberate. They looked like someone cared. And then the 30s happened. This is when Diamond T went from merely attractive to genuinely stunning. In 1933, they introduced a new all-steel enclosed cab with doors and roll-up windows. By 1935, that cab had a streamlined V-style windshield. Tilt personally originated every design, every fender curve, every chrome accent, every proportion. He hired the illustrator Storr Baldwin to create the advertisements, rendered long and low and exaggerated, playing up the sweeping fender lines and the aggressive stance. The copy didn't hold back. Striking a brilliant style, the styling leader among trucks. And if that was too subtle, beautiful. Every Diamond T rolled off the line in red paint, accent striping on the cab, chrome hubcaps, stainless steel trim around the split windshield, an engine-turned dashboard on the Deluxe models that looked like it belonged in an aircraft cockpit. The hood ornament was a chrome sled dog in harness, symbolizing endurance and pulling power. It was elegant, on a truck. The slogan changed from the nation's freight car to the handsomest truck in America. And it wasn't just marketing. They were genuinely beautiful machines. Flowing pontoon fender lines so massive and sculpted they could have come off a pre-war Duesenberg. Aggressive grills, rakish cabs with that distinctive low roofline that made the whole truck look fast standing still. You could spot a Diamond T from a block away. No other truck looked like that. No other truck even tried. But here's the thing. They weren't just pretty. Diamond T was what the industry called an assembled truck. They bought the best components from the best suppliers and put them together with obsessive care. Hercules engines with 7 main-bearing crankshafts cast from high-grade steel. Timken and Clark axles, Warner transmissions, Lockheed hydraulic brakes, full-floating rear axles. Everything was overbuilt. Everything was heavy-duty. The Model 201 pickup, introduced in 1938, weighed 2750 in bare chassis form. The rear springs alone had 13 steel leaves stacked up like a dump truck's. These things were built to survive. Diamond T's own sales literature put it bluntly. The Model 201 is necessarily built heavier than the usual competition, but this additional chassis weight is required to provide its long life and low maintenance cost. Translation: yes, it's heavy. That's the point. By the mid-30s, Diamond T had 1,000 dealers in the U.S. and Canada and 80 distributors in 60 countries. They were building everything from 3/4-ton pickups to 12-ton heavy haulers. The best year was 1936, 8,750 trucks sold. For a company that hand-built premium trucks in Chicago, that was extraordinary. And within a company, you knew the hierarchy by the trucks. The workers drove Fords and Chevys. The boss drove the Diamond T. It was simply called the boss's truck. Then the war came, and Diamond T went to work. During World War I, Tilt had already proven himself. 1,500 Class B Liberty trucks built for the U.S. Army in 18 months. Heavy-duty 3 to 5-ton brutes that earned Diamond T its first military reputation. The Army liked them so much that by the armistice, they'd placed orders for another 2,000. The performance of those trucks in service was so strong that when the next war came around, the military didn't hesitate. So when World War II started, the contracts came fast. Diamond T stopped civilian production in 1942 and pivoted entirely to military vehicles. The Chicago factory ran around the clock. Over the next 3 years, the plant produced nearly 50,000 military machines, prime movers, wreckers, cargo trucks, half-tracks, tank transporters, even the cab-over-engine designs that Diamond T had been perfecting since the mid-30s found military applications. The company ranked 47th among all U.S. corporations in the value of wartime military production contracts. 47th. For a company that most people today have never heard of. But the truck that made Diamond T legendary wasn't built for the American Army. It was built for the British. In 1940, the British Purchasing Commission came to the United States looking for a vehicle capable of hauling the heaviest tanks in their arsenal. They visited several American truck manufacturers. Diamond T had a prototype heavy vehicle they'd been developing for the U.S. Army. A few modifications later, the British placed an order for 200 units. That was the Diamond T Model 980. The specs were serious. An 895 cubic inch Hercules D FXE diesel inline 6, producing 185 horsepower. Some versions got the Hall Scott 440, a 1,090 cubic inch gasoline straight 6 making 240 horsepower. That was the largest gasoline engine in any World War II military truck. Period. The transmission setup was something else. A 4-speed main gearbox mated to a 3-speed auxiliary, giving 12 forward gears and 3 reverse. Timken double reduction differentials. The whole thing was geared absurdly low, walking pace in first gear, but it could pull a loaded trailer weighing up to 120,000 pounds. 54 metric tons. That's the weight of a fully loaded Sherman tank on a flatbed with room to spare. Paired with the M9 Rogers trailer, the combination became the M19 tank transporter, and it went straight to North Africa. The Desert War was brutal on equipment, sand in everything, temperatures that warped metal and blistered paint. roads that barely qualified as suggestions scratched into the landscape. Mechanical breakdowns weren't just inconvenient, they were lethal. A stopped vehicle in the open desert was a target, and the critical job, the one that nobody wanted but everybody needed, was tank recovery. When a Matilda or a Crusader or a Sherman took a hit and couldn't move, somebody had to go get it, often under fire, often across terrain that would stop most wheeled vehicles dead, often in sandstorms that reduced visibility to nothing. The tanks couldn't just be abandoned. They were too expensive, too scarce, and too important. Damaged tanks that could be recovered and repaired were the difference between a unit that could still fight and one that couldn't. The Diamond T did it, every time. The Royal Army Service Corps crews would drive these things into active combat zones, position the truck, spool out the winch cable, hook up to a 40-ton disabled tank, and drag it back to the repair workshops. In the harshest desert conditions on Earth, in sandstorms, under enemy fire. The truck never flinched. The Hercules diesel just kept pulling. 5,871 were built by 1945. Every Allied army in every theater of the war used them. North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, Burma. The British alone took delivery of about 1,000. Some stayed in British military service well into the 1970s before being replaced by the Thornycroft Antar. And here's a detail that tells you everything about how different armies saw Diamond T. The U.S. Army actually preferred the Pacific Car and Foundry M26, the famous Dragon Wagon, for its own tank transporting needs. As late as April 1944, U.S. Army ground forces were on record saying that positive steps should be taken to ensure no Diamond Ts were shipped to any theater except where specifically requested for a specific purpose. Not because the truck was bad, because the Army had its own preferred vehicle. But the Diamond T was the truck the British trusted with their armor across every campaign. It was the truck the Soviets requested through Lend-Lease. It was the truck that worked everywhere it went, in conditions that destroyed lesser machines. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. So let's talk about what made these trucks work at the engineering level, because the numbers only tell part of the story. Diamond T's approach was fundamentally different from the big volume manufacturers. They didn't design and build their own engines, transmissions, or axles. Instead, they specified the best available components from specialist manufacturers and engineered them into a chassis that was designed from the ground up to handle abuse. Take the Hercules Engine Partnership. Hercules was a dedicated engine manufacturer based in Canton, Ohio, and they built some of the toughest industrial power plants in America. Their L-head 6-cylinder engines featured 7 main bearing crankshafts. 7. Most truck engines of the era ran on 3 or 4. That extra bearing support meant less flex in the crankshaft, less vibration, longer life. The engines were deliberately understressed. They weren't making headline horsepower numbers. The civilian Model 201 ran 73 horsepower from 205 cubic inches pre-war and 91 horsepower from 236 cubic inches post-war. That sounds modest. It was, intentionally. These engines were designed to run all day, every day for years, without complaint. The chassis philosophy was the same: heavy-gauge ladder frames with cross-member bracing, I-beam front axles thick enough to look agricultural, full floating rear axles, meaning the axle shafts carried zero vehicle weight. They only transmitted power. If an axle shaft broke, the wheels stayed on the truck. You could limp home. The military trucks pushed this philosophy further. The 4-ton 6x6 Model 968 used a 529 cubic inch Hercules RXC straight 6, making 106 horsepower through a 5-speed manual with a 2-speed transfer case. The truck weighed 18,450 pounds empty and could tow 25,000 pounds on road. Every fourth truck off the line was fitted with a ring mount for a .50 caliber machine gun. The Model 969 Wrecker was the U.S. Army's standard medium recovery vehicle through the entire war. It carried a Holmes W-45 heavy-duty wrecker bed with twin booms and two 5-ton winches, plus its own air compressor and a front-mounted winch. This was a rolling repair shop that could right an overturned deuce-and-a-half in field conditions. But the tank transporter was the engineering masterpiece. That Hercules DFXE diesel displaced nearly 15 liters from 6 cylinders, naturally aspirated. Bosch fuel injection. The engine made its peak power at just 1,600 revolutions per minute. Peak torque of 685 pound-feet came at 1,150 revolutions per minute. This was a low-speed torque monster designed to move impossible loads at walking pace across terrain that would swallow a Jeep. The ballast body behind the cab could hold 18,000 pounds of dead weight, pressing the rear tandem axles into the ground for traction. The winch carried 300 feet of steel cable on the 980, 500 feet on the later 981. The 981 added a front fairlead so the winch could pull forward, meaning the truck could recover itself if it got stuck. Clever. And the transmission. 12 forward gears and 3 reverse sounds complicated, but in practice, it gave the driver exactly the right ratio for any situation. Crawling up a muddy slope with 50 tons of tank on the trailer? There was a gear for that. Cruising on a paved highway at reasonable speed? Overdrive handled it. The system was robust enough that crews could shift without synchromesh and keep the truck running in conditions that would have destroyed anything lighter. After the war, surplus Diamond T980s scattered across the globe. Government sold them cheap. Trucking operators, construction companies, and scrappers bought them by the lot. Most went back to work in civilian roles, hauling heavy loads that nothing else could move. But one of them ended up in the hands of a bush mechanic in Alice Springs, Australia, named Kurt Johansson. Johansson was born at Deep Well, south of Alice Springs in 1915. Got his driving license at 11. By 15, he was driving his own truck. He was a laborer, fencing contractor, mailman, aviator, and inventor. But his greatest achievement started with a challenge. Someone bet him he couldn't build a vehicle capable of hauling 100 head of cattle through the outback. The standard load was 20, 5 times the capacity, through terrain that would destroy conventional trucks. Someone gave him about 2,000 pounds and told him to figure it out. It took him 2 years. Johansson took a war-surplus Diamond T980 tank transporter and built 2 self-tracking trailers with independently steering wheel sets that could navigate the tight, narrow bush tracks and creek crossings of Central Australia. The self-tracking design was the breakthrough. Standard trailers would have been torn apart on the sharp turns and rutted paths. Johansson's trailers followed the truck like obedient dogs, tracking through corners instead of cutting them. He called the whole rig Bertha, and Bertha changed everything. Other operators saw what Johansson had done and followed. 5 trailers, 6 trailers, eventually 8 behind a single truck. The Diamond T had the pulling power to handle it. The pastoral industry in northern Australia was transformed. Cattle that used to take weeks to drive overland could now be loaded and hauled in days. Freighter trailers in Australia began manufacturing self-tracking trailers commercially based on Johansson's design. The modern Australian road train, those 200-ton monsters that dominate the outback highways today, traces directly back to one Chicago-built tank hauler and one bush mechanic with more ingenuity than funding. Bertha sits in the National Road Transport Hall of Fame in Alice Springs today. Johansson is in the Shell Rimula Wall of Fame. Still there. Still a Diamond T now. Here's where the story turns. C.A. Tilt retired in 1946 after running Diamond T for 41 years. He stayed on as board chairman. The company had come out of the war with a strong reputation and a loyal customer base. Peak production years followed in the late 40s. But the 50s brought problems. The post-war trucking market was consolidating. Ford, Chevrolet, and International Harvester were cranking out trucks by the hundreds of thousands. They had economies of scale that a boutique Chicago truck maker simply couldn't match. Diamond T's premium pricing, which had been justified by superior quality, was becoming harder to sustain when the big manufacturers were closing the quality gap while undercutting on price. Tilt died on September 19, 1956. He was the company. His eye for design, his insistence on quality, his personal approval of every major engineering decision. Without him, Diamond T lost its compass. His brother Ned took over as president and general manager, and Ned could see where this was going. The military contracts that had kept the company profitable were drying up. Civilian sales alone couldn't sustain an independent truck manufacturer at Diamond T's scale. 2 years after C.A. Tilt died, on March 28, 1958, Ned sold Diamond T to the White Motor Company of Cleveland, Ohio. White was on an acquisition binge. They'd already bought Sterling in 1951, signed an exclusive sales and service deal for Freightliner that same year to get a West Coast presence without building a factory, acquired Autocar in 1953, and purchased Rio in 1957. Diamond T was just another brand in the portfolio, another name to absorb, another dealer network to fold in, and what White did next was textbook corporate asset stripping, death by 1,000 cuts, each one justified by spreadsheet logic. First, they let Diamond T continue operating as a separate division from the Chicago factory. That lasted 2 years. Business as usual, more or less. The trucks kept rolling. But the decisions were no longer being made in Chicago. They were being made in Cleveland. And Cleveland had different priorities. In 1960, White closed the longtime Diamond T factory at 4509 West 26th Street in the Cicero area of Chicago and moved all production to the old Rio plant in Lansing, Michigan. The reasoning was simple. The smaller number of trucks being built didn't justify a separate factory. Consolidation, efficiency, synergy, all the words that sound smart in a boardroom and mean layoffs on the floor. An entire workforce in Chicago, people who had built Diamond T trucks for decades, lost their jobs, and Diamond T lost the factory where it had lived for nearly 50 years. Then came the cross-pollination. This is the part that guts the brand identity. By the mid-1960s, Diamond T, Rio, and White trucks rolling off the Lansing line were using Rio's R-Cab. The same dual-headlight heavy-gauge steel fenders, the same modified Diamond T three-piece steel hood. The engine options were identical across all three brands. The Rio Gold Comet gas engine rebranded as the DT6170 for Diamond T. The same Cummins and Detroit diesel options in the 170 to 210 horsepower range. The only difference between a Diamond T, a Rio, and a White was the radiator grille treatment and the name on the front. That's it. A Diamond T wasn't a Diamond T anymore. It was a White truck wearing a costume. The last truck that could honestly be called a Diamond T rolled off the Lansing assembly line in late 1966. Beginning in 1967, White merged Diamond T and Rio into a single division, Diamond Rio. The Diamond T name, the logo, the sled dog, the heritage of 56 years of premium American truck manufacturing was reduced to half of a hyphenated compromise. Diamond Rio staggered on. In 1971, White sold the division to Francis Cappert of Birmingham, Alabama, who formed an independent company. New models were introduced. The reputation was still strong, but the economics were impossible. On December 6, 1974, Diamond Rio Trucks Incorporated filed for bankruptcy. A dealer named Loyal Osterland, who'd been selling Diamond Rio trucks from his Harrisburg, Pennsylvania shop since 1958, bought the rights, tooling, and trade name from the Bankruptcy liquidator. He kept building trucks in small numbers, about 2 units per day, 131 trucks in 1978. It was life support, not production. Meanwhile, White Motor Company itself was drowning. The oil crises of 73 and 79 hammered the truck industry. White's aggressive acquisitions had loaded the company with debt it couldn't service. In September 1980, White filed for bankruptcy, listed roughly $1 billion in unsecured debt. It was the largest bankruptcy filing in American history at the time, lost $311 million between the filing and December 1981. Sweden's Volvo bought the remains for about $75 million. So the company that murdered Diamond T couldn't even keep itself alive. The pattern is familiar if you know American industrial history. A small company builds something exceptional, gets bought by a larger company promising resources and reach. The larger company strips the identity, shares the components, dilutes the brand, and eventually kills it. Then the larger company collapses under its own debt. Nobody wins. The original product is just gone. Diamond T isn't alone in this. Packard, Studebaker, DeSoto, Tucker, names that meant something, reduced to logos on collector car plates. But Diamond T might be the most egregious case because the product was genuinely superior, the market was genuinely there, and the murder was genuinely deliberate. What makes this story sting is what Diamond T represented, not just a truck. An idea, the idea that a working vehicle could be beautiful without compromising its function, that quality could coexist with style, that the guy driving the truck deserved something as well-made and thoughtfully designed as the guy driving the car. In an era when trucks were disposable tools, one company in Chicago decided they could be something more, tough enough to win a world war, beautiful enough to make a truck driver proud, engineered well enough to start road train culture on the other side of the planet. And the market agreed. For 56 years, people paid a premium for Diamond T trucks, not because they were foolish, but because the trucks delivered on the promise. They lasted longer. They held their value. They did the job, and they looked good doing it. Today, surviving Diamond T trucks command serious collector prices. A restored 1948 Model 201 pickup can fetch well over $150,000. That's for a truck that sold new for $1,655. The military vehicles are museum pieces, preserved and restored by enthusiasts who understand what they represent. Bertha sits in Alice Springs. A few Diamond T 980 tank transporters survive in military collections across Europe and North America, still wearing their olive drab paint and their Allied star markings. There's an online community called Diamond T Classics, where enthusiasts across the country trade parts, stories, and restoration advice for trucks that haven't been manufactured in 60 years. And the brand name? It's been through more owners than a used car lot. After Osterland retired in the 90s, the name passed through several more hands. A company called Diamond Vehicle Solutions tried marketing a T-Line series in the 2000s, using Navistar cabs and modern components with Diamond T heritage styling. They built a handful for export to South America. Production sputtered out by 2010. The latest entity associated with the name went permanently out of business around 2024. The brand is, for all practical purposes, dead. Again, the factory in Chicago is gone. A parking lot now. The Rio plant in Lansing was demolished in 1979 to make room for new industry, even though it had been designated a National Historic Landmark. The tooling was scattered through multiple bankruptcy liquidation sales. The institutional knowledge, the engineering judgment, the design instinct that made a Diamond T walked out the door with the workers and the engineers and C.A. Tilt himself, and it never came back. 250,000 Diamond T trucks were built between 1911 and 1966. Every one of them carried a logo borrowed from a shoemaker who believed a diamond meant quality. Every one of them reflected the conviction of a man who thought a truck didn't have to be homely, and every one of them belonged to a company that deserved better than what it got. The diamond is gone, but the trucks that wore it are still out there, still hauling, still turning heads, still proving that CA Tilt was right all along. And there you have it, the Diamond T. The greatest American truck most people have never heard of. If you've seen one in person, or if your family had a connection to these trucks, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.